Test and Code, how to apply a holistic approach to testing. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Jeff Payne. I'm the founder of Coverys. I've been building and testing software for 30 plus years. I've started a couple of software companies. My most recent one is Coverys for the last 14 years. We've been helping people accelerate their delivery by leveraging Agile, DevOps, test automation, and application security practices. I do a lot of writing and speaking on all things software development. I'm also the technical editor for Agile Connection. If you're not familiar with Agile Connection, it's an Agile and DevOps free online community. You can sign up if you're interested at agileconnection.com. Every month we publish new fresh content on all topics Agile and DevOps related and talk about today's issues in the software development process. I am so happy today to introduce my special guest for this webinar, and I will let her introduce herself. Her name is Janet Gregory. Janet, welcome to the webinar series.
Thank you, Jeff. So to introduce myself, I've been working with Agile teams for well over 20 years now, which is kind of a scary thing, focusing on testing, focusing on quality in that whole process. So I've been written 3 books, Agile Testing, More Agile Testing, and Agile Testing Condensed, with my fabulous co-author, Lisa Crispin. I could never have done it by myself. We've also together founded the Agile Testing Fellowship, and that's a community where, we're talking about Agile connection or Agile testing ideas. Today, we're talking more on the idea of holistic testing, and we'll get into that here in a bit. What else can I tell you about myself? I'm from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Though I've escaped winter, I'm lucky enough to be able to do that now. So been down in Arizona for the last 3 months, and I'm leaving today, so road trip. I'm not looking forward to 3 days of travel. It's just not my favorite thing to do. So this is kind of a send-off for me.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Janet. Welcome. Good to see you, and have a great trip after this. We're here today, though, to talk about holistic testing. Let's kick things off for those that aren't familiar with your concept of holistic testing. Can you explain a little bit about what holistic testing is and kind of how it came about? How did you come up with this idea?
So we've been, Lisa and I have been talking about Agile testing for 20 years now, but it is to the point where when there's very few people that don't know what Agile is. There's a lot of new people coming into it that have never experienced waterfall. So it makes no sense. They don't differentiate between waterfall or Agile. It's just, this is how we work. And we're finding that more and more. The other part is that testing activities are ingrained in everything we do. So I think it's more important, especially as they move to DevOps and continuous delivery, to look at testing from a holistic point of view. How does it all fit? How do we get a strategy in place so that we can address that? Maybe you can put up my first slide and I'll talk to that a little bit.
Absolutely. Let's do that.
I did a blog post, and you can find it on janetgregory.ca about holistic testing. And it came about, we were trying to figure out how to think about it. So Dan Ashby has this great post called Continuous Testing. So go and read that. He started talking about, took the traditional DevOps loop and took out the test part of it and said, we test here and here and here, all the way around the DevOps loop. Testing was continuous, it was around. But I looked at that DevOps loop and I thought it doesn't really represent what we do. So I've made a few adjustments, and this is how I think about development, right? So if we look at thinking about, because it's not a horizontal line, it doesn't have a stop or an end most times. never as far as I'm concerned, but we start with a discover, right? We might have a new feature, a new idea. The discovery is kind of where the business people are trying to decide, what do we want to build, or what's the idea? Does it have a return on investment even? And then we start planning, and we, can spend more or less time at these different stages, for lack of a better word. We plan, and then the understanding, thinking about what is it we're going to build? How are we going to build it? What are the questions we're asking? So we do this before we ever build it. So building to me is that, how do we code and test and make it happen? We deploy it, we release it to our customers, and then we observe it. Hopefully we learn from it, and then we apply it to the next loop. So it's just this continuous loop of, discovery, planning, understanding, and so on. And to me, this speaks better to that instead of the DevOps loop, because test isn't a phase. It happens at all of these different stages. So I've put in little pauses in this because I think we need to reflect. So after each stage, we would say, for example, discovery. Do we really have a business plan for this? Does this actually make sense? Reflect, stop. It's not a gate. It's just, does it make sense? Before you start planning it. The same with planning it. Do we even have the necessary people to be able to do it? Do we have what it takes? Do we have the technical skills? You plan. Pause. Do we have those? Yes or no? Should we move on? And it just goes all the way through. Pause to reflect. Does that make sense to you, Jeff?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. What I like is, taking testing out, as you mentioned, it really emphasizes the testing's not a phase in here. It should be part of all these activities, right?
Yeah, yeah. And Elizabeth Hendrickson has a quote that I use a lot. Testing is not a phase, it's an activity that happens throughout. And to me, that makes so much sense. Can you move on to the next slide? These are the only 2 slides, people. After this, we're going to just talk.
Just talk.
Yep. Yeah. So this kind of shows the testing activities that might happen at each of these stages. So for example, the discovery is testing the ideas, determining the value. And I view these as testing activities. Same with the planning, thinking about the risks, right? Some of the practices we might do is risk storming or something like that, to be able to think about what risks do we have? Can we mitigate them? In the planning, we'll also be thinking about how do we make testable stories? And then we get down to the understanding. And to me, this understanding part is people don't stop to think that they are actually testing. So when we use things like acceptance test-driven development or PDD, we're actually testing our assumptions. When we're using concrete examples, doing example mapping, we're testing, do we understand what we mean? And so I call that early testing, right? There's no time associated with any of these activities, depending on your feature or your stories, right? Maybe we go through something really fast. Maybe we end up going through it a little bit slower because we realize we don't have a good understanding. We need to break it up into more stories, perhaps. Maybe we have to spend a little bit more time really thinking about what this means. I was doing some consulting a while ago, and the team was all ready to take this feature and start building it. And I said, well, let's just try something first. So we did a mind map of the feature. As it turns out, they didn't have a very good idea at all about what was needed to be done. They were missing some really big pieces. So they took the whole feature and kind of put it back because they had to go find out things. How much easier is it to do that before you start coding? So thinking about these as testing activities, I think, is an important thing. When we get into the building, by this time, hopefully we have a really good understanding of what we are. That's when we get to start automating and maybe instrumenting the code so that we can do that observability later on, right? We're actually doing, making that happen, making the thoughts into code to give to our customers. We deploy it, and we might deploy it many times. When we deploy it, we still have a lot of other testing to do. We're testing the infrastructure, especially if you have it in the cloud. It's easier to test that infrastructure. But perhaps you actually have physical environments. You still need to test all of those things as well. Our automated tests will be running on a regular basis, and our build or our deployment pipeline as well. How do we progress? The other part that is in here is the idea of testing quality attributes. Some of you folks may still call them non-functional, which never quite made sense to me. So thinking about them as quality attributes makes much more sense. So we're testing a lot of different things there. And then again, we release to production, and depending on your situation, you might be able to test in production if you have a safe way to do it. If you don't, then don't test in production. And then we observe. So if we've instrumented the code to be able to know what we wanted to do, then we can start observing. We can monitor and learn from that. The important part on learning is experimentation, right? We're testing our hypothesis. We think if we change this, I expect this to happen. So it actually is a testing activity when we're learning and we turn it into an experiment.
I had a couple thoughts on that. I love that diagram, by the way. It's really nice. So what I like about it is, first of all, you have risk in there, right? And you talk about identifying risk, and I assume then, that risk concept you pull through your entire testing process, right?
Absolutely.
Which I like that. A lot of models you see, even other approaches that are talking about testing in more of a continuous delivery model, they don't talk a lot about risk, which you have to talk about, right? We can't test everything. I love that. The other thing I love is that you're talking about testing not only the application, but any code or environment or system, right, that your application must be successful on. And that's another thing you don't see in a lot of the testing models that are out there. They don't talk about the other things that have to be tested.
Yes.
And it gets us away from just thinking of software testing as being testing of the application, right?
Yeah. And I actually have stopped using the word software testing. Either say product testing or testing, because it's not only the software we test. As soon as we say that software testing, we've made a little bubble and we're testing the software. And you just, as you said, there's so much more.
Yeah, so let's elaborate on that a little bit more. So there's models out there, and there's a term out there that we hear a lot, which is continuous testing, right?
Yes.
How do you differentiate holistic testing from continuous testing in your mind? How related are they? Are they the same thing? Are they different? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so continuous testing was a good term. Unfortunately, in my experience, in my opinion, whenever I read about it now, it's kind of been hijacked by some of the tool vendors, and they use it to mean automation. And so they just kind of eliminated all of those human-centric kinds of testing that we need to do. And if you look at that model, that whole left side of that model is kind of about testing ideas. It's not automation, it's human-centric. Even when we get into after deployment, there's some automation, but we still have to do a lot of the quality attributes. For example, say accessibility. We can do some automation, but there's some things that need a human eye to actually look at. Does this make sense, right?
Yeah, usability too, right?
Exactly.
Which is a hot topic right now, is customer experience and usability. And mean, those are not things typically, at least not all attributes of usability can be looked at by a computer and determined whether it passed or failed, right? It's a subjective customer experience kind of a concept, and
Yep.
you can't automate those things.
Yeah, and so I think those are some of the reasons that Lisa and I have chosen to use the word holistic. We're actually even changing our course name from agile testing to holistic testing, strategies for agile teams, right? So because it just makes more sense now. It just makes so much more sense.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's great stuff. So talk a little bit about how in your model you think about shifting left and shifting right and moving from maybe where you are to something. How do you think about those terms? You hear that a lot in continuous testing, right? Yeah. Let's shift to the left, let's shift to the right. What do those things mean to you? How does that fit into your thinking around holistic testing? And what do you think about that?
Yeah, so quite a while ago now, I wrote a blog post on why I hate the terms shift left and shift right.
Okay.
But I was thinking about it as applied to a linear line, right? Because that's when people draw the software development life cycle, they draw a line. And that seems to indicate that there's a stop and a start. Where by using the continuous loop, right, there is no real stop or start. It's just you keep adding, you keep changing. And so when I hear the terms shift left and shift right now, I could, in my mind, I just think, okay, left side of the circle of the loop, right side of the loop, right? So the left side of the loop is all about are we building the right thing? The right side of the loop is, are we building it right? And I think those are two very different kinds of focus. So in my mind now, I can do left and right, but not if you think about it as a linear line. It just doesn't make sense to me, because what will happen if you think about it as a line is that shift left, where do you stop? Pretty soon you're going to end up with big upfront requirements again. That's what's going to happen if you shift left too much. And none of us want that anymore, because we know they don't work. Except in specific course,
Yeah, I guess in an infinite loop, if you shift left far enough, you end up back on the right too.
Exactly.
I guess in theory. I don't know how that would work in practice, but I get what you're saying. I like that idea of the left side of the infinity versus the right side. I also know some people, I love your opinion about it. There's some certain kinds of testing that doing it in production in certain situations makes sense, right? Many of us were taught early on, you should not test in production, don't ever test in production, right? So we had this idea pounded in our head that you needed to, at least in that situation, shift a little bit to the left.
Yes.
But now what you're hearing is a lot of people are saying, well, wait a second, there's data you can collect, there's things you can do in production that don't impact the customer, but give you very valuable information for your testing process. You have any thoughts on that and how that fits into holistic and shifting right and all these things?
And I think when I hear people panic when I say the word test in production, it goes back to when we couldn't, because I used to have people say, yeah, well, let's just test this in production. We'll just put in this piece of data, which then messes everything up, or you maybe mess up some client data. That is not what testing in production means these days, right? It's not cowboy testing, which is much of what it used to be. So there's two aspects to it, I think. There's what you talked about, the observability, monitoring what our customers are doing, which sometimes leaves me with the idea that Big Brother is watching. I got,
there you go.
Okay, somebody is sitting there watching every keystroke I do. And it can get to be that much. So where is the, if you think about privacy and stuff, so we have to be very careful that way. What can we observe in a safe manner? But there's a second part of testing in production too. So things like if we use feature flags, right? We can have it turned off and be looking at it, maybe how customer data kind of looks through it or something. Or in some instances, some teams have the idea of blue-green environments, right? They're duplicate environments. And our production version with all our clients is on the green one. The blue one is an exact replica, except with the new stuff that we're trying to test. And so we can look at it on there, and when we say we're happy with it, then the blue becomes the test environment and the green one is live, right? So testing in production can be done safely that way too. And so but it's context, right? It's, I think everything has to be taken in context. I remember years ago watching James Whitaker do a keynote at Star East, I believe it was, and said, here at Google, we let our customers test. And at the time I say, please, please, please add a word, say in our context, because in their context at that time, if I was using Google Maps, for example, did I expect it to be perfect? Would I drive off, the end of a road into a lake if it was wrong? No, right? But if you're doing something like building a heart monitor or airplanes, right? You want to be very careful about what you're doing. You're not going to let your customers test and get, oh, look, that heart monitor failed.
Yeah,
He doesn't
darn.
like that so much. Yeah, exactly.
We'll roll it back, right? A little late.
So you want to be knowing your context. Nothing is the same for every single team. And I think that's the other portion of this, that you have to build your own strategy. Use these building blocks, but what makes sense in your context? I think that is things that people miss. They don't think about that, right?
Yeah, and that's the other part of risk, right? I mean,
It
there's
is.
risk around, what do I have time to do? But there's also risk around, what's the impact of failure? And you have to understand that for that context.
Yeah.
I used to laugh when Google used to say, a lot of our teams, we don't have testers any longer, right?
Mhm.
We don't have testers at Google. And I used to always say, oh, you have testers at Google. They're your paying customers. That's who your testers are. Now,
Yeah.
that could work for you, right? Based on maps or whatever, that could
Yep.
be okay in context. But to say that's like how the world's going to work going forward, and that's not true,
No.
right? In a lot of context,
Yeah. For
So
sure.
tell me a little bit. So the name of this webinar is Test and Code,
Yeah.
right? And I love that phrase because everybody, traditionally we talked about code then test, and then you heard a lot of test before code or test first, right? But your concept is these two are in sync, right? Can you talk a little bit about the philosophy of test and code as a way to think about this process, right?
Yeah, I think that when you start to think about them as one process, right, that they're intertwined, that you can't do one without the other, that when you eliminate that, throw it over the wall, somebody else will test it, right? So even at the very beginning, when you're getting an understanding, those programmers are in those conversations. They're thinking about implementation. They're not actually coding yet, unless they're doing maybe a simulation or a spike or something, but they're thinking about implementation. So when we're testing ideas and they're thinking about their implementation, it's intertwined all the way through. So I tell people to take that then, code then test, because it's in our heads when you start to think about it. You automatically assume that testing comes after, but it doesn't. It's intertwined. So take that then, throw it away, put it in an and actually flip it to say test and code, so that you're thinking about testing first, but it's still intertwined with coding all the way through, right?
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. And that, in the chart you showed with different testing activities, right? You mentioned ATDD and BDD in that left-hand side, which
Mm.
is, in my mind, all about getting those involved in testing and coding and business all on the same page.
Yes.
How do you see that? Does that support, in your view, the holistic model, a BDD, ATDD model? Do you think that's an important component when you're thinking about, doing these things together?
Yeah, I think it is, because I see acceptance test driven development or behavioral driven development about really getting to understand what you need to build, right? So when we do that, it's we're thinking about design, implementation, we're thinking about what does it take. And that's what guides our development. Those, whether you choose to call it BDD or ATDD or specification by example, they all have the same premise. We're guiding development with examples, right? And concrete examples. And I think that when you start as a team, or at least, the power of three or three amigos, whatever you want to call it,
Yes.
when you're thinking about what aspect do we need to think about. So if we take concrete examples, and if I use the 1 + 1, so we want to add two numbers together. That's what we want to do. So an example would be 1 + 1 = 2. Okay, I can visualize that.
Yeah.
But then I might also say, but here's another example. What do I want to show if I say 1.0 + 1? Do we want to show the 0.0 if it's an integer? And then the whole conversation will come out about how many decimals do we want to show? How many decimals do we need to keep? How many places is that? Are we only taking integers? So the conversation will grow. And that's, to me, what that is about, because when we start to think about it, the implementation is coming at the same time. The programmers are thinking about, oh, how are we going to do that? I never thought about that. And we're going to start talking about it early.
No, that's awesome. And I assume you mentioned quality attributes, AKA non-functional non-functional testing. I like that, by the way, that notion. I assume then you should be, and we see oftentimes organizations are not thinking a lot about all the quality attributes when they're going through that process of trying to make sure that everybody understands what it is we're trying to ultimately deliver to customers. So I assume you feel that's a pretty important piece of that conversation.
For sure.
And do you consider, when you use those, which of those terms do you use, by the way? Do you use specification by example? Do you use ATDD? Do you use BDD? Does it depend? I'm just curious, because this is an ongoing debate at Coverys about what the right term is, and are these exactly the same or different or whatnot? What do you think?
Yeah, well, BDD and specification by example have very specific words they use. I like to say they're allergic to the word test, right? And acceptance test driven development is a more generic term. It doesn't belong to any one thing. So I usually use that term. But if I'm going into a company and they're using BDD, then I will use that. But quite often I hear BDD being used as we're writing Gherkin, and that's not what it's about. It's just a way of expressing it, right? It's more. But I want to go back to your quality attributes kind of comment.
Yeah.
When we first start talking about risk, right, and in the discovery and in the planning, that's when we start thinking about how do we mitigate the risk. And I think quality attributes, when we're testing for them, we're addressing those risks. That's what we're really doing. And things like acceptance test driven development, it addresses the functional risks. Are we building the right thing? Whereas the other kinds of risks and the quality attributes it's a different type of testing, right?
Yeah. And to your point earlier, we were talking about like context, right? I mean, your
Mhm.
context is probably going to tell you the importance of those various quality attributes, right?
Yes.
Some will be more important than others based
Absolutely.
on what the impacts are in whatever you're building.
Mhm.
And that thinking up front, that planning, that, thought process is critical
Yeah.
to understanding what it is your focus is for testing.
Yeah, and I think it will make a difference on what you are building as well. So if you think of the Cynefin model, right, where they have simple, complex, no, simple, complicated, complex, and chaos. If you're in a really simple feature and you've done this kind of feature 100 times before, you're not going to spend much time in planning because you actually understand. You kind of know what's going on.
One other topic I wanted to talk to you
Okay.
about, and then we're going to switch to questions and other fun stuff, some polls, as Alexa mentioned,
Okay.
is how automation fits into this whole process and what your view is on
Mm.
automation. There's obviously lots of debate and discussion around what to automate, when to automate, how much to automate. Can you automate everything? Should you automate nothing? Where does all that fit into your model, and what's your kind of view? Because I know test automation is a near and dear topic
Yeah.
to your heart. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how that fits into the model and how you think about it.
Right. So I view test automation as a tool to help us, right? And so when we think about automation as a tool, I want to get the best out of it. So the things that I know exist and I know how to test, and we're going to test them over and over and over again, that is what I want to automate, right? That makes the most sense. I still use models like the automation test pyramid to think about it, not as a hard and fast rule, but to say, what can we automate that's the closest? So from a programmer perspective, gives us the fastest feedback. And that's where the unit tests come in, right? And the programmers kind of do that. But then I'm going to think about what else can we test, and what is the closest to the code we can test them at? Because the closer the tests are to the code, the faster the feedback is. And that's where we talk about testing, say, business rules at the API level, right? I know some of the tools now, they want to do more end-to-end test. They're self-healing and all of these other wonderful things, but I want people to be very careful about what they do when they're doing those kinds of tests. Are they actually saving you time? Does it add value, or are we better at the API level? Just think about how it's going to be maintained. And I also think that a lot of people take some of these tools now and don't think about how to do good automation, right?
Right.
Thinking about maintainability. And if I go off and I say, hey, Jeff, go use this tool and automate everything.
Yeah.
Right? If you know nothing about building a test suite, I know that I'm going to be throwing that test suite away in a year because we won't know how to maintain it. Nobody will know what it is. You've just done your own thing.
The concept of things you're going to do repeatedly over and over again, you might, in DevOps, we call that toil, or in Lean, we call that toil, right? The things that you do manually over and over again that
Right.
ideally you'd figure out a way to allow the computer to do it for you.
Yep.
So you can use your brain to do things that aren't toil. And
right.
I mean, I like, one of the things that we always try to do when we're thinking about where tests go in your process and what kinds of tests to automate is, what are those tests that you have to do repeatedly and they're not really using your brain, right? Once you figure out what those tests are, there are things that you probably would like to have just automated so you don't have to do them. And that's, and thinking through toil and where are those things that, there's not a lot of value in you doing as a human, are great places to start with your automation.
Yeah.
And low level, as you mentioned, near the code.
Yeah.
Because, the other thing about end to end is, is if you haven't done any testing until you get to the end to end, finding bugs is like a needle in a haystack at that point. And the haystack is huge for the apps we build. And it's just too late to reveal bugs. And so
exactly.
you just can't take that kind of inverted
Yeah.
pyramid approach.
Yeah. So I think if you think about it as fast feedback, that's
Mhm.
what you want, right? And if we have to repeat things over and over and over again, if we want to do it as human beings, we're going to make mistakes.
Yep.
The computer, it just, sees
It'll
ones
do
and
it-
zeros. It
Do it
does,
the same
right?
way every time.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, fast feedback's a great way to look at it. Also, one of the things we always pitch or push is if you want to build software in an agile way where you're incrementally adding,
Yes.
sprint day over day, sprint over sprint, you're adding new capabilities. As you know, the risk in adding anything is that you might break something.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have that safety net of some sort of regression suite
Yeah.
or tests that you can rerun to make sure what used to work still works,
Yeah.
you're potentially going to degrade the quality of your application using an
sure.
agile process because
Yeah.
you're incrementally changing things constantly, or even just refactoring, right? I mean, we talk about refactoring like it's no big deal, right? You just
Yeah.
go in there, you change some things. Well, that introduces bugs
It
unless
does.
you
It
have
can.
some sort of safety net.
Yeah.
And your regression tests are your safety net if you do it
Yeah.
right.
I think of the automation as a change detector.
Mm-hmm.
Did we change something that we didn't mean to change, right?
Yeah.
Because automation won't find new bugs. Maybe if you're using some kind of model-based testing, it might,
Yeah.
but most of the automation we do isn't that. And
Mhm.
so it will only find changes. It's not going to find the unknowns, right? We need to use our brains, and that's where that human-centric things like exploratory testing really help as well.
So is automation checking then, or
Yeah,
not?
I think
That's
of it
a
as
separate
it's
webinar.
checking. That's a check, yeah. But I do use the word check because it checks. I think of it as a big check mark. Does it
Yeah.
still do what it's supposed to do, right? And that's
Right.
what it is. It's checking to make sure it's still running again, and it is. But there's all kinds of other testing that happens.
Absolutely.
And I don't mind calling it test automation because it's just the word that most people understand.
Yeah, that's fair. Any final thoughts on holistic testing, the model? Anything else you want to tell the audience before we transition into Q&A and get them involved in this?
I think the last thing probably would be think of it as a strategy. So use the model. The ideas that I have up there for testing activities are definitely not all encompassing because it just isn't. There's a lot more out there, but use them as ideas to think about your strategy and plan your strategy. Think about what testing activities can I do in discovery? What can I do here? What are these testing activities? And really carry it around the whole cycle and think about what that means to your team, to your organization, or to your products, whatever the case might be.
That's awesome. So let's jump over and do a couple polls, and then we're going to take some questions. So the first one, and Alexa's going to open the poll so everybody can poll. And then the first question is, what's your biggest challenge in testing right now that your organization faced? All right, well, it looks like testing not well integrated into dev and need more automation are the two that were the highest, with testing is taking too long next. What do you think about that, Janet? Anything that sticks out to you in that regard?
I find it, so need more automation. Really thinking about, and I see that all the time. We need more automation. We don't have enough time to do it, or whatever, right? So I think the two together, the need more automation and the testing takes too long in our delivery process, those might kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, that's fair.
And I think when the testing not well integrated with dev, when we use processes like acceptance test-driven development, the conversations that we have to have with, say, testing, and how are we going to test that? That, to me, that's the single best question ever. How are we going to test that? It kind of starts to force the developers to start thinking about testing as well. And I still see, which is sad to me, that testing is a throw it over the wall and they're catching it. So I'm hoping, I'm glad to see it's not like 80%. 26% is better than it used to be, but
Yeah.
yeah. But the lowest is, well, non-functional, because those quality attributes, yet that seems to be case across the board. But I'm glad to see that quality issues in production is only 13%.
Yeah,
That's that to me is that's a positive.
that is a
It should be zero, but it
Yep.
recognizing it's not.
So, is your organization using continuous or holistic testing approach? Just in general, right? Are you using it? Are you not using it? A little bit. Majority of what you're doing you would consider to be holistic or continuous, or have you completely embraced it? Where are you at?
I'm excited to see the results of this one.
Any predictions?
No, I have no idea. Actually, I have
Not yet.
absolutely
A
no
little bit,
idea.
majority, or all? What do you think it's going to be?
I'm going to think it's, I don't know. I'm going to
We don't
say,
want to see the audience,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
They'll
So
change their votes. All right, looks
based
like
on what I've
it's
seen, yes, I'll say it after
okay.
the show.
Yeah, it looks like it's slowed down. Why don't you share
Okay.
the results, Alexa?
Yes.
And there you go.
That would have been my guess.
Yeah, mine too.
Yeah, that's what I see,
Mhm.
is that they're starting to think about it. But so half the people are at least starting to think about it. There's very few teams that actually have, and they do exist. I know they exist.
Yeah, they do.
They have that
Mhm.
continuous flow. But a lot of teams, sometimes when I go in and I talk to them and they'll say, yeah, we've got this, we're thinking about this. And you start asking a few questions and they'll go, oh,
Yeah,
maybe not.
maybe not. Yeah. No, that's
So,
a
but
good
it's
one.
good. But this is good.
Yeah, if we had a couple other categories, I mean, it's kind of bell-shaped, which
Yeah.
you sort of expect, right?
Yep.
You know, there's not a huge amount of people not yet
Yeah.
going in this direction. There's not a huge amount of people that have yet made it to the destination, and
Mhm.
a lot of people are on the journey. Right?
Yes.
So.
Yes.
Good. Awesome. So for those of you that have stuck around, want to give you a thank you. We do have some upcoming classes at Coveris that you might be interested in. We have an API testing workshop coming up in early April and a test automation for practitioners class as well. And then don't forget about upcoming conferences. Janet mentioned STAR conferences. STAR East is coming up. We're back in person, April 24th to 29th in Orlando. And then those of you that want to hit the slots, our Agile DevOps conference in the West is going to be at Vegas in early June. As a thank you to anybody who participated today, get a 20% off an in-person Powerhouse Pass for STAR East or ADO West. So here's the codes. You can use those to register. If you have trouble, you can always talk to customer service. Also want you to continue the conversation. Those of you that aren't a member of the TechWell Hub, it's a Slack-based software professional community. Lots and lots of channels with lots and lots of things to discuss. I'm actually going to head over to the hub after we finish here today. I'll be in the testing channel. If anybody wants to ask any questions we don't get to during our Q&A that we're going to start here in a second, join 80,000 or 80,000, yeah, 8,000 people who are members of the hub. It is free. You can go to hub.techwell.com to sign up if you're not a member, and jump on over in the testing channel if you want to chat a little bit more after we finish up here today. I do want to announce our next webinar. Just watch your mail. You'll get a notice on it. For those of you that don't know David Bernstein, David is an XP guru. He speaks, writes, and he's an author on a lot of things associated with dev testing. So unit testing, test-driven development, those are his fortes. You know, if you're in testing, you want to learn more about those kinds of things, definitely come. If those are the, you know, the bailiwick of your paired developers, you know, bring them on. I think they'll really like David. He speaks and writes and trains all over the world, and should be a fun webinar. Tentatively penciled in, by the way, for June 9th. I don't think that date's going to change, but you'll get a notice on it probably in a month or so. So you can register if you're interested. And then Janet's got a lot of stuff going. You want to talk for just a second about the stuff you've got going on here, and then we can take our questions.
Yeah, you can, if you have any questions, you can also, on any of my websites, there's a contact page, but my email is janet@agiletester.ca, CA for Canada. Just helps people remember that. But go and visit our agiletesting.fellow.com to kind of look around at that. As I said before, we're changing the name of our course and a little bit of the direction from agile testing to holistic testing. And so that's in progress there. I'll be attending the Agile Testing Days in Chicago in June. It's a conference, I think it's 3 days. Lisa and I have a tutorial, Lisa Crispin, should say her name, have a two-day tutorial on holistic testing, and we'll be talking about that. I don't think it's called that because we named it before. Anyhow, I ramble, but please send me an email, or you can get me on Twitter or LinkedIn at any time. And yeah, that's about it.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Janet. Now we're going to take some questions. I'm going to stop sharing here so we can see her again. Alexa, have some questions been rolling in for us?
Yes, we have 3 so far.
Awesome.
First question is, when is the best time to pause and reflect at each stage of the loop? Is it at the end or when we are halfway through the stage?
Good question. I think I'm going to say it depends, but I'll qualify that, because if I'm working on a really complex problem or a really complex feature, I may want to pause several times to say, do we have the right people in the room to be talking this? Do we have the right information? If it's smaller, it probably is just a quick check. So if I take the example of a story, before I take a story into my iteration, or if I'm doing Kanban, and before I start working on it, that would be kind of transitioning from the understanding to the building. And so before, a quick check would even be, is this story ready? And ready might be defined as something as simple as, have we thought about all the dependencies? Have we handled all the dependencies? Is it small enough? Do we have our acceptance tests for it, or acceptance criteria, if you like that word? That might be all a pause we need to go from understanding to building. So it will depend on how big your chunk of work is, how well you understand it, what the risks are. And so just kind of test a little bit what makes sense to you. And it will vary depending on what you're building.
That's good advice.
Okay, next question. Can you talk a little about how automation fits in?
All right, so we did cover that a little bit. I think we need to start thinking about it early. So in that loop, I think it was an understanding, I'm gonna kind of think about it, is I said, when you're thinking about what it needs to do, think about also what events are we going to have to monitor, right? So as we're thinking about what events do we have to monitor, for example, when we get into building, the programmers can instrument the code so that we know what we're going to monitor. We also want to think about, when we're doing acceptance test driven development, how are we going to test this? And those guiding development with examples, that's a precursor to automation. So I will have a conversation, if I'm the tester on a team, for example, I will have a conversation with the programmer who's working on the story, or programmers, and I'm going to say, so this is what I think the tests will look like. These are the examples. If we take a simple login, I'm going to pass a username and a password. And what's the expected result going to be? How are we going to know that login is successful? Do we have a session ID? How are we going to represent that? That is thinking about automation, because we're going to create a test that has that, right? The test will read in that data, and then the programmer can start doing their coding and their little TDD cycle of, write their unit tests until that first test passes. So even in understanding, we're thinking about automation. We don't actually code it until we're building, but we can start thinking about it early. Same with would go with the quality attributes. If you have some way of testing those automated tests, you want to start thinking about that from the beginning so that you know how you're going to do it.
Yeah, I would add to that. You kind of alluded to this earlier, Janet, that testing through the user interface kind of end to end is very difficult. And unfortunately, a lot of the products on the market, that's what they support or provide. And it always looks great in a demo. It always works great when the salesperson does it.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of challenges with focusing your automation at that level. And I'm sure you've seen it, right? I mean, tests are flaky. Sometimes they rely on timing. That makes it difficult, right? You don't really want tests that aren't deterministic, right? When you're trying to automate, because you don't want that manual intervention. They're slower because you have to go through the UI layer, and they're brittle because the UI changes a lot, and because the tests, if you're using anything that's capturing them for you, are usually not written to be maintained by humans. And so, I'm a big believer that, you can do some smoke tests and some other things end to end, have some basic tests that you feel like maybe you want to do repeatedly, but your testing should be lower than that. You should get yourself down to the API level, get yourself down to the service level. You mentioned getting it down into the code as close as the code as possible, unit, testing your user stories, maybe not through the UI. Those types of tests are fast, they're repeatable, they don't break all the time, or they break less. They're easier to maintain, and that's the key in automation. You got to be able to maintain these things to make it worthwhile.
I like to say one purpose, one test, right? So when you do an end-to-end test, and there will be times when you need to do those for sure, because you do need to test the UI and you do need to touch the database, both which slows it down. But if you can run all those other tests first, you have a much better chance of getting a positive result, because you will have found the little ones. If it's one purpose, it's easier to maintain, because I'll go to that particular thing and say, oh, look, my username has a space in it. It broke. I don't have to go through. I can go fast. It's easy to fix.
And then, by the time you get to those longer running tests, those end-to-end tests or whatever they are, that hopefully you've demonstrated there's quality at the lower levels. So now you're just focusing on those kind of integration.
So the purpose of those end-to-end tests is I can make the whole cycle. So I have one verification. I made it to the point I want to get to, right? I'm not verifying all the way along.
Yeah, and that other things have been verified, so you don't have to worry about them. And that's the whole idea of the pyramid, right? That foundation, get the foundation right, get your unit level and your lower level testing right. And then what that means is you have to do less and less testing, because you've verified things at a lower level. Now you're just integrating them and testing integrations.
And somebody on the chat I noticed was, it takes a long time to develop test automation before it's useful. But if you start at those lower levels, then it's easier to develop, right? Because you're working with the programmers, you can develop it at that stage, and it's the faster feedback. It will take a while if you're just starting to get all of it. So one time, I'm just gonna story, we were starting from scratch. So the first thing we did was go to our business people and said, what flows have to absolutely work? And we put in full end-to-end tests for those, I think it was 8 flows, which absolutely had to work.
Mhm.
And then we started going down and building up the rest of the automation, and just took it as part of each iteration. We would build automation for each story we were working on, because that was part of our definition of done. But we also would take in 1 or 2 extra stories every iteration that said, okay, here's these set of functionality, let's create tests for those. And we slowly over time made our automation, but we made a deliberate choice.
Mm.
Right?
Yeah.
Because it does take time, and it is
does.
an investment.
Absolutely. But if you don't invest the time, then you're not going to get the benefits out of it on the other end. That's the other thing.
Yes, exactly.
Well, it looks like we are almost out of time. Alexa, did we have one more question, or did other ones pile in? Are we close to?
We had
Yeah.
one other question from someone. What if you don't have testers on your team? What are your recommendations on how to use the holistic testing model?
Yes, if you don't have testers, then the rest of the team is going to have, the team is going to have to step up. So they're going to have to figure out, and quite often then having a test consultant, I'll call them a consultant, and it can be internal to the company, but having them help the team figure out what their testing strategy should be. But it means that the rest of the team has to pick up the slack. They have to learn how to test. They have to learn how to think about all of these things. And having a model like this will, it's not going to do it for them, but it will help them realize all of the different pieces that they have to think about. And a lot of teams just aren't ready for that yet. But I don't want to say I see a trend, because I'm very much a fan of having an embedded tester on a team, but I do see a lack of really good testers. And so there tends to be more of a consulting kind of role happening in many organizations.
Yeah, I'll go out on a limb and say that usually the model of having no testers on a team doesn't ultimately work.
Very
Sorry.
well.
I mean, if you're in that
It's-
position, you're in big trouble. And it has to do with a lot of different things, including what developers want to do and like to do and how much they know about testing.
Yep.
And I mean, you can pair up and say, all right, you dev and I test this, and you can do things like that. I have not seen that model typically work. Occasionally, given the sophistication of the people and if they have the right attitude, it can work. But, you
Yeah.
know, I always tell, it's like my kids when they went to college, I said, you need to graduate from college. I know Bill Gates didn't graduate from college, but I got news for you. You're not Bill Gates. So graduate, don't use him as the example. And so I always tell teams, don't use those few teams that have no testers that figure
As the
out
example.
successfully how to be, you know,
Yep.
deliver quality code, because that is not the norm. And I've
Yep.
seen way more teams that thought that was what they needed to move toward, and then a year later said, oops, bad
Oops.
decision,
Yep.
and started hiring back, you know, professional testers because they just, they couldn't make the quality, they couldn't keep the
It's-
quality there.
Yeah, yeah.
So I would be very careful of that model.
Like I said, I'm a fan of testers embedded on the teams because there's so many little things that come up,
Mhm.
but it can work. But exactly what you were just saying, it will depend on the team and how well they embrace the idea of testing.
And you're probably not Bill
Learning it.
Gates, so.
You're probably, yes.
And with that, Janet, I'll let you go. I know you got to get on the road. Thank you so much
Okay.
for joining us today. I hope everybody enjoyed it.